1. A double-decker ferry carries visitors to the windward side of Guantanamo Bay Naval Base and drops them off at the bottom of a hill just short of Camp Justice. A handful of current and former detention sites, with names like Camp Echo and Camp Delta, cluster near the southeastern corner of the base, tucked behind chain-link fences topped with loops of razor wire. Those facilities, still in use, hold a small number of detainees awaiting proceedings, as well as others who will never see their cases presented at Camp Justice. The ferry docks at a utilitarian parking lot on Fisherman's Point, but the lot's bare pavement fails to reflect its storied history. In 1898, the U.S. Marines landed here during the Spanish-American War, coming ashore the morning of June 10th, setting fire to a seaside village and capturing the Spanish blockhouse perched above it before lunchtime. The hill became a wartime camp, then a permanent base, and U.S. forces never left. A bronze plaque embedded in a cairn of white stones by the water's edge commemorates an even earlier invasion. On Christopher Columbus's second voyage to the West in 1494, he visited Fisherman's Point too, having already claimed Cuba for Spain. The plaque states that Columbus and his men were hunting for gold, but, not finding likely prospects, they left the next day. For more than 400 years after Columbus's expedition, Cuba remained a Spanish colony. But in the 1890s, Spain created the world's first concentration camps on the island. The death toll unleashed by that decision eventually led to the loss of the colony, with U.S. Marines coming ashore on the same spit of land where Columbus had stood centuries before. Until a few years ago, I had no thought of traveling to Guantanamo. My interest lay in writing a history of concentration camps. 21st century detention at Guantanamo might have seemed disturbing, but it had not occurred to me to think of it as a concentration camp. The more time I spent researching mass arrests and detention, however, the more Guantanamo kept creeping back into view. I couldn't imagine writing about the place without going there. And so, in 2015, I made 2 visits. The first gave me a chance to observe pretrial hearings in the case of the 5 9/11 defendants who make an appearance in the last chapter of this book. Not being obliged to file a story on deadline, as other journalists on the trip were expected to, I opted to fill in for the absent sketch artist and absorb as much as possible in a courtroom custom-built for prisoners in the War on Terror. Having arrived in the 15th year of an ongoing story, I wanted to catch up. My second trip took me to the detention camps, or at least the ones that I was permitted to see. In both cases, setting foot on Guantanamo was like entering another world. The thousands of personnel and dozens of buildings that made up the machinery of detention for what was then a little over 100 prisoners felt overwhelming. The issue that most troubled me, the legitimacy of holding untried suspects for more than a decade, was not the minute-to-minute concern of the soldiers and sailors who were busy doing their jobs. The big questions had been decided elsewhere. There the detainees sat, and there they would remain as long as those orders stood. Yet after September 11, 2001, the U.S. consecration of Guantanamo as an ideal site for extrajudicial detention had been greeted with the same international dismay elicited by Spain's inauguration of reconcentración, mass civilian detention, in 1896. In crucial ways, the 21st century American detention camps at Guantanamo are descendants of the 19th century Spanish camps. But there are many generations between them, each iteration carrying elements of the old while evolving into something new. The history of concentration camps circles from Cuba, around the world, and back, visiting 6 continents and nearly every country along the way. Camps have been in existence continuously somewhere on the globe for more than 100 years. Barracks and barbed wire remain their most familiar symbols, but a camp is defined more by its detainees than by any physical feature. A concentration camp exists wherever a government holds groups of civilians outside the normal legal process, sometimes to segregate people considered foreigners or outsiders, sometimes to punish. If prisons are meant for suspects convicted of crimes after a trial, a concentration camp holds those who, most often,